Warhammer 3, it's nearly here. We don't even have the base game yet, but why not speculate on the DLC anyway? What factions might we see come to Total War Warhammer, and what's the ultimate end game of Total War Warhammer? When will they stop making DLC and end the updates for it? Well, it's probably a good few years off yet, and we can most definitely expect some unit pack DLCs much like we've had for Warhammer 2 for the past couple of years, because the rosters of Warhammer 3 are quite small, with only around 25 units each, compared to the 30 or 40 units that Warhammer 2 factions have with their DLCs. So we can definitely expect some unit packs for Kislev, Cathay, all the Chaos Gods, and of course them Ogres. But who might the first faction DLC being added to Warhammer 3 be? Well, I think the most obvious answer is the good old Chaos Dwarfs. We've already seen that they have lands in Warhammer 2, both the Northern Darklands and the Southern Darklands provinces that could be taken in Warhammer 2, although no signs of Chaos Dwarfs here, although we do have some Chaos Dwarfs in Warhammer 2. Those little fellas operating the Chaos Hell Cannon are Chaos Dwarfs, so they are around in the game already to some degree. And because of the existence of the Darklands already, and this big open space in the top corner of the map, we always wondered maybe the Chaos Dwarfs would be added to Warhammer 2, because why is this corner completely empty when the other three corners of the map are full up? Seemed a bit strange, and maybe they did plan to put the Chaos Dwarfs in Warhammer 2 before the release of Warhammer 3, but maybe COVID came along and ruined that plan, who knows, but there is also a part of the Warhammer 3 map that looks a bit suspicious, like it's ready for some Chaos Dwarves. This part of the Warhammer 3 map is completely empty of any factions starting in it. We see the Eastern Oblast to the west, which is where Kislev are. We see the Mountains of Morn up north, where the Ogre Kingdoms reside, and nobody starts in this area here. And there is the Plain of Zar province in there, which I believe relates to Chaos Dwarfs, if I'm not mistaken. And it's next to the World Edge Mountains, where the Darklands are in Warhammer 2. They're not called the Darklands on this map for whatever reason, but it is looking like those are the Darklands where the Chaos Dwarfs reside. So, most likely Chaos Dwarfs not only going to be a DLC faction, but may well be the first DLC faction we get. To some other factions that have land in Warhammer 2, the Southern Realms, which is technically two factions. Estalia, which have been around since Warhammer 1, they're kind of the Spanish-themed faction of the Warhammer world. I'm not sure how fleshed out they were in tabletop, but they do exist and have existed for a while. There's also the Tilian army, which is an Italian-themed faction. Again, not entirely sure of their presence in the tabletop and how big and popular they were. I kind of feel like neither of these two factions will actually make it to being a fully fleshed out faction. Of course, what CA wants to do with it is all going to depend on what Games Workshop wants to do with it and their revitalizing of the Warhammer Fantasy tabletop. If they don't plan to bring them back for the tabletop version of the game, I doubt we're going to see them in Total War Warhammer. Another faction with some land in Warhammer 2, Albion. A faction that's based on kind of Celtic Britain, with tribal warriors and nobles on chariots. Their island sits just off the coast of Norsca, as it does in Warhammer 2 here. You can see it's got a little island of its own. But maybe this faction is unlikely to be seen because it kind of sounds very similar to Norsca. Although Games Workshop and CA do a very good job of making these new factions, the Vampire Coast for example, and of course Grand Cathay, made from the ground up pretty much, with Total War Warhammer in mind. So not impossible, I'm sure they could do something cool and make them a bit different from Norsca if they were to bring them to life, but there's probably some more exciting options. One of which could be Araby. Another faction that has some lands already in Warhammer 2. We can see the Great Desert of Araby right there and the coast of Araby to the north. This could be a really good candidate for a new faction, I think. It would obviously need fleshing out. I think it had a fair few units in tabletop though. It had elephants, it had magic carpets, it had camel riders. I'm sure we'd see some units with scimitar swords, those classic kind of Middle Eastern looking swords. This I think could be a really cool faction and would be something quite different from what we already have. And they're a faction that could obviously occupy this area, but there's plenty of deserts all over the map where they could go and be part of as well. So it seems like a really good fit for Total War Warhammer. Definitely a faction I'd like to see come to the game. What about a faction that's a bit more popular with people though? The Dogs of War. If you don't know who these guys are, it's basically a mercenary faction of all mixed races. Orcs, dwarfs, ogres, humans, all fighting alongside, all for that money. A pure mercenary faction. To me though, it seems unlikely that they'd be added as a separate faction, and it also seems odd to me that they added the Ogre Mercenaries to Warhammer 2 so late in the game, right before Warhammer 3. It seems like it was a tester for maybe a mechanic of having the Dogs of War as recruitable mercenaries by everybody, just like how the ogres are recruitable now in Warhammer 2, rather than them being their own separate faction. That would be my guess anyway. If we are going to see the Dogs of War in Warhammer 3, they'll likely just be spread out recruitable mercenaries for everybody, rather than being their own faction. But they could bring some exciting new units all the same. Another potential faction, but probably an unlikely one, is the Halflings of the Moot, another place where we already have some land for on the Warhammer 2 map. And if you basically imagine hobbits from Lord of the Rings in the Shire, you've pretty much got the Halflings there. They seem to have a fair few units in their roster. They seem to use a lot of animals and things as mounts. But for whatever reason, like I say, I don't see this one being likely to get a full faction at least. Maybe it could be a DLC adding on to another faction just to get them in there for the fun of it. But yeah. Now let's boogie over to the Warhammer 3 map, where we can notice something kind of interesting, which may potentially indicate a couple more future factions. Draw your eyes over to the Grand Cathay lands. This area of the map has actually been rotated and squished onto this campaign map. If we look at an old tabletop version of the world map for Warhammer Fantasy and rotate it, it'll look something like this. You can see the area of Grand Cathay there, you can see the Mountains of Morn below, and the Great Bastion is kind of a vertical line. Now if we compare that to CA's version of the map, we can see the area of Grand Cathay, we can see the Great Bastion wall, which is kind of a vertical line at this angle, and we can see the Mountains of Morn below. So we can see the two areas have been married up, and the map on the left has been rotated to fit the Warhammer 3 map, which has also been rotated because the Warpstone Desert you can see on the right hand side, just below the bottom of the yellow circle, Warpstone Desert, that's classed as being in the west of Cathay, which makes sense with the rotation. So what is below Grand Cathay on the old map? Well, boom. We have the Kingdoms of Ind, which is a faction kind of based on India. Doesn't seem to be a ton of information on them though, and what kind of units they might have had. In the hinterlands of Koresh, there's talk of snake men and blood naga queens, which I guess is some kind of snake lady. But most interestingly here, at least to me, is the islands of Nippon. We can see on the right there, this is the kind of feudal Japan influenced faction, so samurais, ninjas, warrior monks, Shogun 2 basically, and there is listings of Nippon units out there as well. It does seem like one of the most likely factions to get a full fleshing out, much like Grand Cathay did, given the popularity in general media of that kind of Japanese culture and history of samurais and ninjas and stuff. So yeah, could this be the future of the Total War Warhammer 3 campaign map? Having these three areas added on next to Cathay where they are in this old version of the map, it marries up to what we have in the version of the Warhammer 3 map at the moment, which would mean that the Kingdom of Ind and Nippon would be factions in Warhammer 3. And if we take a look at the full version of this old map, you can see all the other areas of the map we already have. Lustria, Nagarond, Ulthuan, the Araby area where the Tomb Kings reside, the Empire up in the north, you've got the Southlands which we already have. The new Warhammer 3 map is adding those bigger Darklands, the Mountains of Morn for the Ogre Kingdoms, the Grand Cathay area, which only leaves those few areas on that right side below Cathay that we don't have. The Kingdoms of Ind, the hinterlands of Koresh and Nippon, and maybe some Lost Isles down the bottom there as well. But there we have it, some of the possible factions that may come to Warhammer 3. If I had to take a guess, I would say that definitely the Chaos Dwarfs are coming, and it would seem to make sense that the Kingdoms of Ind and Nippon would arrive as well, based on that geography of the map that we don't have yet. If you're going to add that in, you have to add those factions, surely. I also think Araby, as I said, would be another cool one to add in, so if we got those four, I think that would be a nice cool selection, but who knows what Games Workshop has planned and what they want to bring in. I guess they are the ultimate decider. I suppose the end game of Total War Warhammer 3 would be that full old world map, all of it on there. Like I said, we've got most of it, there's just a few areas we don't have. Once that's added in, all the factions are fleshed out with DLC and all roughly with an even amount of units, about 40 each. Plus 4 or 5 new DLC factions for Warhammer 3, and maybe that's the endgame. Could be 3, 4, 5 years off, and then we'll have Total War 40k. So that'll be good. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future.